Welcome back to Chinese 270, China and the West. Where had we left off last week? Well, we had discussed a group of intellectuals, reformers, some of whom had studied abroad, like Yongwing, some of whom had traveled abroad, like Huang Zunxian, some others had only read and learned about the West. But they all had embraced reform. They all had embraced some kind of self-strengthening. They all had realized that China needed to change if China was going to be able to face that new challenge really from the Western world. We had also discussed that to some Chinese, to some maybe more conservative forces, there was a fear that too much reform, too much westernization might actually threaten the essence of China, the very institutions this reform movement was meant to protect. Now, China in the late 19th and early 20th century was increasingly weakened due to several outside forces and inside conditions, economic challenges, civil wars, natural disasters, and increasingly imperialism and foreign aggression. Here you have a cartoon from that period of these imperialist powers, all each trying to get a piece of that map of China, and maybe you can work out who represents who. We can discuss that during our discussion session. But here you have a map then of Qing Dynasty China, and you can see quite clearly that these different imperialist nations all have an interest in China, right? We have the British, they of course already dominate India, and we know that after the Opium Wars, right, they had gotten control of Hong Kong and Shanghai and the Yangtze, and then in yellow here the French, who already had started to colonize Indochine, and purple the Japanese, who increasingly eye Korea and Manchuria, where they clash with the Russians, here the Germans in Shandong. Now the dynasty eventually came to an end, and the end was rather sudden and probably surprised a lot of people. In 1911 there was an uprising in Wuhan, a big city, over the sale of railway rights, and this in itself was connected to imperialism because of a lot of these railways were built by Westerners. It was essentially a form of investment, private railway lines. And there is, an uprising, and this uprising then leads to the overthrow of the Qing court and the establishment of the Republic of China in 1912. Now, here we have to just say a few words about Sun Yat-sen, Dr. Sun Yat-sen, Sun Zhongshan, picture of him here on the right, 1866 to 1925. Born in Guangdong in the south of China, later moved to Honolulu in the Kingdom of Hawaii, to where parts of his family had already immigrated. He received a Western education by attending missionary schools, later trained as a doctor at the Hong Kong College of Medicine. He returns to China or Hong Kong, and he increasingly embraces anti-Qing, anti-dynastic reformist ideas. And in 1912, he actually becomes the first president of this newly founded republic, the Republic of China. Now, this was only possible because of a number of compromises that were forged with military strongmen. One of them, Yuan Shikai, who was China's strongest military leader. And soon after, Yuan Shikai actually usurps power. He himself makes himself president. He really wants to be emperor, and he ushers in a period of warlord rule that further weakens China. Now, Sun Yat-sen really is a very important figure, and he's so important that he even has a statue at St. Mary's Square in San Francisco's Chinatown. If you've never seen that, you should all get on your bikes or take the streetcar and make it to Chinatown and find that statue. Now, the founding of the Republic in 1912 and the end of dynastic rule also opens a new chapter in Sino-Western relations. And the first chapter comes with World War I. Now, as Britain and France and the Allies in general suffer losses in the European war theater, they ask the government of the Republic of China for help. And China sees an opportunity to rid itself of the unequal treaties imposed by the Western powers in the wake of the Opium Wars, sees an opportunity to rid itself of all that imperialist incursion in China, especially, of course, of the Germans in the Shandong Peninsula. So in 1917, China declared war on Germany, and its justification was that Chinese merchant vessels had been targeted by German submarines, which was complete humbug, but there you have it. And China dispatched about 150,000 non-combat laborers to serve in the Chinese labor corps throughout the Western Front in Europe. They dug trenches, they repaired bridges, manufactured ammunition and machinery, and more than 10,000 Chinese would actually die in service. And here are some images from that period. Here is Chinese riveters at the tank corps workshop, entrance to the Chinese laborers' camp near the ammunition factory of Vange in France. And here we have Chinese workers leaving a Christian lecture in a YMCA hut in northern France, a British captain and a Chinese interpreter sharing a meal, 1917. And here is actually a cemetery to those Chinese who died in Europe. Things did not pan out the way the Chinese had hoped. So they had hoped that the grateful Allied powers would reward China's contributions by granting recovery, especially of the Shandong province that had been occupied by the Germans. But instead, the Allies dismiss China's petition and instead awarded the former German possessions to Japan, which greatly enraged the Chinese population, and it led to a big uprising called the May 4th movement of 1919, because it started on May 4th. And it was really motivated both by anti-imperialist sentiments and, maybe somewhat ironically, a veneration of the West, but really more Western science and thought. So these young people wanted even more reform, more modernization. Now, another chapter in Sino-Western relations, especially Sino-American relations. And of course, since last week, we discussed that the West really increasingly became America after centuries of essentially being Europe. And that is, of course, the chapter of Chinese immigration to America during the late Qing and, the early years of the Republic. And I'm sure you've all studied that in your Californian history classes. Let's just quickly recap some of the key facts. So large-scale Chinese immigration to the US began around the Californian gold rush, the 1850s. Immigrants were driven by civil wars back in China, economic changes, and of course, as we discussed, some of this was actually directly the result of Western imperialism, right? Like the Opium Wars. Now, later, many found employment during the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, right? Roughly 20,000 Chinese laborers, or 90% of the workforce. And they were appreciated for their work ethics and the fact that they were largely non-unionized, as many of the other immigration groups, the Irish, etc., were asking for higher wages. Leland Stanford, who of course had been one of the big investors in the Transcontinental Railroad, told Congress in 1865 that without Chinese laborers, I quote, it would be impossible to complete the western portion of this great national enterprise within the time required by the acts of Congress. All of this leads to another really dark chapter in Sino-Western, Sino-American relations. And that, of course, is the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is maybe the darkest stain on Sino-Western relations. Anti-Chinese riots increasingly flare up over competition for jobs, especially in the wake of post-Civil War recession. Anti-Chinese sentiments increasingly driven by racism. And you have a cartoon here on the left from that period, which in turn is largely a product of 19th century nationalism, ill-defined Darwinism, and the quasi-science of eugenics. The visible presence and willingness to accept low-paying non-union jobs made them easy targets. Now, the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was the culmination of a series of anti-Chinese law, and it drastically restricted legal migration, and it led to a clampdown on illegal immigration. Now, why is this such a stain on American history, Sino-Western relations? It was for the first time in US history that a specific ethnic group was denied access to the naturalization process. And interestingly, this did not go unnoticed by Chinese observers. Huang Zunxian, who I'm sure you all remember, we already read a poem of his, right, when he visited Hong Kong. He also wrote a poem about precisely that, the Exclusion Act. He offered a scathing criticism, and I've posted that to iLearn for you to see. Now, this also led to the construction of the Angel Island Immigration Station, which was put into operation in 1910 in the San Francisco Bay. And I hope you have all heard of that, maybe visited it, and if you haven't, you all should visit it. Surrounded by public controversy from its inception, Angel Island was both known as Ellis Island of the West and the Guardian of the Western Gate. And almost all of the roughly 175,000 Chinese immigrants who entered the US between 1910 and 1940 passed through Angel Island. And here you have a photo. Now, what I have done on iLearn is I've posted some poems for you to read that were left by Chinese immigrants who stayed at Angel Island and who carved poems in the walls of the detention center. And a lot of those poems survive to this day. And here is just one. Twice I have passed through the blue ocean, experienced the wind and dust of the journey. Confinement in the wooden building has pained me doubly. With the weak country, we must all join together in urgent effort. It depends on all of us together to roll back the wild wave. 两经沧海历风尘，目无激流悲痛深。国若急当弃奴隶，狂澜待万丈同群. And these poems are also tied to this week's assignment, to this week's forum, the Angel Island Poetry Response Forum. So what I want you to do is I want you to read those poems that I posted, and I want you to choose at least one poem from that list and carefully read the poem and then write a response addressing at least some of the following questions. What emotion does the poem express? How do Chinese people feel about the way they are treated? What do they feel is the reason for that treatment? What does the writer of the poem suggest to do about this injustice? What does the poem tell us about the expectations those Chinese immigrants had? What did they hope to find in America? How does the poem reflect on Sino-Western relations? Does the poem still speak to us today? Can we think of similar situations, similar injustices? And please make sure to cite from the poem or poems if you want to look at more than one by including lines you find particularly powerful. Now, in addition to the poems, I also posted a chapter on the Angel Island Detention Center, and the chapter itself also talks a little bit about the Exclusion Act and the history that led up to that. And once more, if you have never been to Angel Island, you have to promise me that you plan a trip. Soon you can take a boat from downtown near the ballpark. It's a beautiful ferry ride, and it's now the Angel Island State Park, so it's a museum. You can visit a lot of those facilities. They've been turned into a museum, and there are a lot of artifacts to look at. And of course, you can even find those poems on the walls. They have been beautifully restored. Okay, I will see you shortly for our second course stream.